Coming up next,
More What's New, Scooby-Doo.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Ed, Ed, and Eddie.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Johnny Test.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Total Drama Island.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Cartoon Planet.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Tom and Jerry Tales.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Tom and Jerry.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Looney Tunes.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
DC Nation.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Annoying Orange.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Ben 10 Omniverse.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Garfield, A Tale of Two Kitties.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Adventure Time.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Pokemon the Series XY.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Clarence.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Beyblade, Metal Fury.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Scaredy Squirrel.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Almost Naked Animals.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Garage Band.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
The Amazing World of Gumball.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More The Amazing World of Gumball.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Courage the Cowardly Dog.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Uncle Grandpa.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Codename Kids Next Door.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Codename Kids Next Door.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Garage Band.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Hole in the Wall.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Mad.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Steven Universe.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Adventure Time.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Total Drama. Ben Juliana.
on Cartoon. Coming up next,
More Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Teen Titans Go.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
More Teen Titans Go.
later,
A new The Amazing World of Gumball.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new The Amazing World of Gumball.
later,
A new Polaris.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Polaris.
later,
A new Adventure Time.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Adventure Time.
later,
A new Regular Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
New Legends of Chima.
later,
Teen Titans Go.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Mad.
later,
Annoying Orange.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
DreamWorks Dragons. Riders of Burke.
later,
Teen Titans Go.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Teen Titans Go.
later,
Cartoon Planet.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Regular Show.
later,
A new Mad.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Teen Titans Go.
later,
The Looney Tunes Show.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
A new Annoying Orange.
later,
Incredible Crew.
on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Incredible Crew.
later
Regular show.
on Cartoon Network.